this is Kier, and Madison's not with me right now because she's at a track meet, so wish her good luck even though this is a feature video. So, anyway, we're doing Unit 3 Agriculture, and as you can see by our photo, it's obvious it's going to talk about agriculture. And these are all the basic concepts and all the prior knowledge and all the different types of farming. So, we'll begin with hunting and gathering. The concept of hunting and gathering began way before the Neolithic or the first agricultural revolution. What happened is these cavemen right here, they moved along with food sources, so if they ran out of something, they would travel and not stay in the same place, after all. They're a forager society, and they are a nomadic society in which most or all food is obtained from wild plants and animals. And that's different from nowadays, because nowadays we just gather crops from the ground, or just ranching. So this society can be permanent, temporary, or both, depending on the mobility, but most of them are very, very temporary, just because there's no tribes way back then that could permanently stay. Hunting and gathering was presumed to be a subsistence strategy from its appearance about 200,000 years ago by Homo sapiens. It remained the only mode of subsistence farming until the end of the Mesolithic period, about 10,000 years ago, when the Neolithic Revolution became. Nowadays, there's less than 300,000 people that remain with the hunting and foraging society, just because it's not as common, and most countries are developing or developed in some way, so they don't really need to. An example of this would be the San people, which is S-A-N or S-A-A-N. They're a tribe in Africa that continue to hunt and gather in today's modern society. Now we move on to modern agriculture. Nowadays, in the U.S. anyway, we rely on commercial farming, but in other places, such as those in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, they continue to remain with their families as subsistence farming. So we're just going to talk briefly about the subsistence and commercial farming. Subsistence farming is where farmers grow enough food for their families, and commercial farming is they produce food to be sold in markets and groceries. For example, right here, this subsistence farming family has a cow to give milk for only that family, and they have enough wheat to make bread for their family, and they don't really have extra, and if they do, they sell it as cash crop, but that's very unlikely, as they're not really developed and don't have transportation, so they just do that. And right here in the commercial farming, they grow enough wheat and corn, it's a popular crop, and they sell in the market to gain profit for their next harvest. Okay, on to our next concept. And now we're going to be speaking about origin of agriculture. Agriculture began as simple as hunting and gathering, like I talked about before, but as time progressed and more people saw that resources were running out, they realized that settling would be a proper decision. In each of these green little places, even right here in Sub-Saharan Africa, with the dotted dashed lines, all the green spots represent origins of agriculture. It was an evolutionary time, as knowledge was what progressed that led to the initial setting. And all of these places, they have in common that they're very fertile and they have a lot of water. As we gain the knowledge, we learn more and more about these things. And this man right here, named Carl Sawyer, began the theory of cultivation. He was a prominent cultural geographer, and he believed that there were two types of cultivation. There was seed agriculture, and that there was vegetative. It's really hard to say. Vegetative planting. Vegetative planting is cutting off the stem of a plant right here and dividing up the roots of a plant to place on the ground and grow again right here. It's a really good picture in that it shows what they do, in that they grab the sprout and just rip it off and plant it as another spot. It wasn't effective at first, but it was the initial settling of our knowledge. We found this out, and so this is how we began to do all these things. And as time progressed, we learned about seed agriculture. Farming through planting seeds rather than planting part of a parent plant. That's what the purpose of seed agriculture is. This type of farming is prominent nowadays, and I'm pretty sure we all know that, in that there are a lot of seeds, as you can see in this picture. Let's count them. No, I'm not going to count that. That's a lot of seeds. But it leads to higher crop yields just because more equals more. Well, and Carl Sawyer identified 3 hearths in East Hemisphere, and I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's not over here, and 2 hearths in the Western Hemisphere. That was what he came up, but these are all the potential origins of agriculture. Now I'm gonna erase this just because there's a lot of things on here. Now we're gonna move on to agricultural hearths. Agricultural hearths. The origination was that Carl Sawyer thought that vegetative farming knowledge first began in Southeast Asia, where it was most prominent just because of the fertile lands and the effervescent places that they have there. And anyway, it has a good climate, and the terrain provided a very easy growth. From here, the hearths diffused to very different locations. Mesoamerica, these are just examples, all possible origins of agriculture. Mesoamerica, Indian America, West Africa, the Nile River, Mesopotamia, the Indus River, and the Ganges Delta, and East China. Yeah. The spread and formation of the vegetative planting. Vegetative planting spread from countries north and east to Japan and China, and west to South Asia, Africa, and Mediterranean. And they formed by independent innovation in South America, Andes Mountains, and West Africa. You don't need to know that, but it's just good to have knowledge of it. And so we move on to our next concept.
The next thing we have is the first agricultural revolution. This replaced hunting and gathering, and it started to build communities. This process happened around 12,000 years ago, and it allowed for more food to be produced and the development of civilization to start. The populations were continue to grow, and seed agriculture occurred. Seed crops are crops that are reproduced by the cultivating of seeds of the plants. Seed agriculture may have occurred in different hearths like Western India, Southwest Asia, Southern China, Ethiopia, Southern Mexico, and Northern Peru. Now let's move on to the second agricultural revolution. The second agricultural revolution was thought to begin after the Industrial Revolution, but it actually began in 500 BC. In the second agricultural revolution, they had an open lot system.
One large plot of community farmland that all villages worked to produce crops to eat. So it's sort of like a subsistence agriculture, except there's one plot they all share, and it's the villages. So whatever crops they grew over here, they all get to share and eat. But as capitalism grew, feudalism diminished, and the villages enclosed their farmland. So as it continued, this just became gone out of our existence. And they grew into their own little plots. This was called the Enclosure Movement. where villages closed their farmland and gave them individual plots. This massive urban migration was formed due to the immense growth of the industrial economy and the decline of feudal villages, causing a widespread urban migration. What happened was, people, back in the Middle Ages, let's just pretend this is a castle of some sorts. It looks really, really bad. But what happened was they declined. These feudal capitalists just declined. And so instead of having their own little community farmland, they just had individual farmland. They had their own little plots to grow. With this growth, with the growth of industrial revolution, many farmers moved into cities. Some of these farmers moved into the big town and the cities, and you could kind of tell that because of the industrial revolution and the growth of more and more industries, and it produced more money, so that's why they did. So because of this growth, they needed more farming. The demand of food products rose like crazy, dude. And with that, they needed a substantial amount to suffice with the amount of people that are leaving. So they created new innovations in farming, right here, and transportation. So, with that, led to more and more crop yields and easier transportation access to the cities and the rural areas, which meant that there was a great increase in the amount of things. And we had new fertilizers. Let's just pretend that's a bag of fertilizer. And field drainage and irrigation system. And these all led to the revolution. Alright, now we're going to begin talking about the types of agriculture. We begin with subsistence agriculture. And subsistence agriculture is agriculture designed to support food for only the direct consumption of the family that created the food. It's self-sufficient. That means that there's only enough for themselves and maybe a little bit left over sold as cash crop. Most of these are in LDCs, and as you can see, we drew Africa right there to emphasize the fact that they're in LDCs, as Africa has a lot of less developed countries. And they're divided into three different parts: shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence agriculture, which is both extensive and intensive, we'll talk about that later, and pastoralism. Shifting cultivation is a form of subsistence agriculture in which people shift activity from one field to the other. Each field is used for crops for relatively few years and left fallow or left desolate and make the nutrients come back for a relatively long period. This method is successful in making sure nutrients in the soil are in tip-top shape for consecutive years. They're mostly found in tropical places like Africa, the Amazon, South America, and South Asia, but they're still in LDCs. They use the slash and burn method, which is cleared by cutting existing plants and then burn the rest to create a cleared plot of new farmland, which is called swidden. SWIDDEN. Now, they're in Central Africa, North, South America, Southeast Asia, and grassland. And they have negative aspects of slash and burn. We have deforestation, erosion, nutrient loss, and biodiversity. Those are just the negative aspects. They're dependent on labor, not technology, because they are in least developed countries. However, this method is being replaced by farming methods such as cattle ranching, logging, and production of cash crops because most countries are developing closer and closer to more developed country, and it's declining worldwide. Now we move on to intensive subsistence agriculture. There's two types. It includes both extensive and intensive. It's just a different type. Extensive is using a large amount of land to cultivate food for the farmers to eat. Intensive is cultivate small amounts of land very efficiently to produce food. Like in Southeast Asia, where people use it really well because it's very tight there, but they have sufficient space and use terracing to produce a higher yield. Rice is the dominant crop in intensive subsistence agriculture because most intensive subsistence agriculture is in South Asia. They use double cropping, which is harvesting twice a year from the same field. And finally, we have pastoralism. Pastoralism is the breeding, raising, and herding of animals to produce food, shelter, and clothing. It can be sedentary or nomadic. Most common type of pastoralism is transhumance, which is the movement of animals herded to cooler highland areas in summer to warmer lowland areas in the winter. They depend on trading for their animals to thrive. This method is also declining worldwide. Next, we have Mediterranean agriculture right here. Greece is a mass producer, that's why I drew the Greece flag, of many of the Mediterranean agriculture products like olives and grapes. The Mediterranean, it's around the Mediterranean Sea where climates are hot and dry summers, and they have mild and wet winters. Farming involves wheat, barley, vine, and tree crops, and grazing for sheep and goats. They also have olives, figs, and grapes, and staple tree crops. Mediterranean farming can be subsistence or commercial, and extensive or intensive. Commercial farming. Commercial farming is what we know of mostly here in the U.S. because the majority of U.S. farmers are commercial farmers, which they produce crops to sell in the market. They have mixed crops and livestock farming, ranching, dairying, and large-scale grains production, which we're going to talk about later. We have mixed crop and livestock farming, which involves the growing of crops and raising animals. It can be present throughout Europe and Eastern North America near large urban areas where ample land is not available for extensive practice, and they use crop rotation for this. Ranching is the raising of animals on a plot of land on which they graze, and it's an extensive type. U.S. ranchers are covering to fattening farms where they are fattened before slaughtered, declining around the world because of the low grain prices. And now we move on to our next. Next, we have dairying, which is the growth of milk-based products for markets. They're close to the market because it is the most perishable product, which is explained in Von Frieden's model, which we don't cover, but I'm sure the next group will cover it very well. We have capital-intensive farms, which use machinery in farming process, and labor-intensive, which is human labor. They have the milk shed, which is the zone around the center which milk can be produced and shipped to the market without spoil. Next, we have large-scale grain production. As you can see, we have the breadbasket as our example, and it is a region which because of its richness of soil and advantageous climate, produces an agricultural surplus. The wheat is the dominant grain, and it's the world's leading export crop. Grain is very common because of the extensive use of it from breads to more complex foods. It's common in Canada, U.S., Argentina, and etc.
Plantation farming includes large-scale farming where they show interest in one or two crops that are exported, like wheat and cotton. This type of farming usually occurs in tropical or subtropical regions. Some of the crops that can be produced are coffee, tea, pineapple, rubber, coconuts, tobacco, and cotton. This type of farming is usually located on coastal areas, which allow export to be easy to other countries. And in southern United States, cotton was a prominent export crop, which was grown by black Africans who had worked as slaves.